What was not happening, as I make clear in my report, as I understand it, there was never an in-depth investigation of Horizon. What we were doing here was looking at individual cases. But because of the age of the cases sometimes, because of the many complications, you weren't going to find the smoking gun in any individual case. That was the problem throughout.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a recovering public servant and a managing director of the Good Trouble Group. Joining me today on Ghana Land are my two fellow recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison.
So, last episode we spent some time unpacking lessons to learn around running a review or an inquiry, and we started with can you and should you even do one, and what should be in the terms of reference. Today we're going to go through some of the next steps. So let's say we've agreed we're doing one and we've got some terms of reference. Take us away with step 3, Caroline.
Yeah, so step number 3 is choose your investigator, and this one I like to call the one where you're avoiding the big four. We're going to start by hearing from Paula Venables, who was the Chief Executive of Post Office, when her chair, Alice Perkins, you may recall from last episode, decided against the advice of the Post Office, because everyone thought they were very busy, to commission an investigation into what was going on. And so here's Paula talking about why they chose a company called Second Sight over a company called Deloitte.
But why was Second Sight proposal preferred to that of Deloitte?
I think because of what I just said earlier, from my own recollection, is I felt very strongly that we needed an organisation who would be able to work well with sub-postmasters. I was concerned that any one of the big four, Deloitte being one of them, may have come across too corporate and wouldn't necessarily have had the understanding of running a post office and small retail businesses. I don't recall, which is why, let me finish what I'm saying. I don't recall looking at the proposals in detail at the meeting.
That's what I was going to ask. Rather than which might be preferred by sub-postmasters, how it might look going to one of the big four, was the substance of what each organisation was going to do a relevant consideration?
I don't recall that.
I love this example because it is like a brilliant example of form over substance entirely. Like literally the evidence from both Paula Venables and Alice Perkins is that they don't recall that there was any difference in the proposals between Second Sight and Deloitte. And they literally just chose Second Sight because they thought the sub-postmasters would bond with them more. And that is like, I mean, I guess it's good, right? That they're thinking about who their sub-postmasters
It's not entirely irrelevant, especially if you are trying to get information from aggrieved people who might not otherwise be minded, are not compelled to participate with the inquiry and might not be minded to share everything.
Yeah, and I think what's unsaid, but I think comes through in some of the earlier responses to different things that had happened in Post Office and then later responses to reports Deloitte actually did, is that like maybe also there was a sense not just that sub-postmasters might not be willing to share, but also that they might not believe what they might be worried that the big four might be too, as they say, client-friendly to poll, and therefore they might be really worried about like they might just not believe them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that a thing? Do we think that's a thing?
I think in the light of everything that we know from recent similar controversies and from Robo-Debt, right, there is hugely a risk that people perceive, and that perception is not always inaccurate, that a paid consulting firm is being paid to get to a certain outcome.
Yeah. And even if they're not paid to get to a certain outcome, that they will pull their punches in the way they express the outcome, maybe, as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the nature of those reports at the end can be very full of wally words. Whereas if you compare that to royal commissions or some parliamentary inquiries, like let's face it, the aggression with which Commissioner Holmes ran her room was very, I mean, she wasn't worried about who was going to give her next job.
Nope.
Right? And I think that's effectively what we're saying, which is if you are in the Big Four, you have a long future ahead of you in getting more work. Whereas, I mean, we tend in Australia to use retired judges very often. And there's a reason we do that. And the reason is because they are on a funded pension. They are not looking for their next job. And there is, it does remove almost every possible conceivable risk that they would be not impartial or not go hunting the truth down.
And they're compelled to retire at an age where some of them still have plenty of juice left.
I genuinely thought you were going to say they still have their faculties and I was going to go you for being ageist. But no, you're right. They have lots they want to contribute and they've retired too early. I mean, I think that gets to a good next question in this, because one of the things that we kind of see repeatedly in the post office situation is they will hire a lawyer where there's no particular reason to think a lawyer is the right person to do the investigation. So sort of most significantly, and we'll talk about this a little bit next, when Tim Parker is made the chair of Post Office after Alice Perkins, so in 2015, Baroness Neville Rolfe, my God, the best name. God, I want to be Baroness Neville Rolfe. Anyway, Baroness Neville Rolfe, who is the minister, says to him, I really need you to poke around and understand what's going on. And so he chooses a QC to go do it. And he's asked about it quite a few times on the stand. It's like, why on earth did you choose a QC? And it's clear he hadn't really thought about choosing anyone else, to be honest. Like, I think he just sort of thought, I kind of need someone who knows how to write a good report and can do an investigation and might know a bit about stuff and knows how to get across unfamiliar content quickly. Yeah. What do we think about lawyers being the place where we go to for these kinds of questions?
I mean, I do think we have to have a think about what the skill set is that is needed vis-a-vis the line of inquiry, right? Because they're not always going to be the same, and some may require a particular technical expertise. I'm of the school that thinks the practice of law can be, but isn't always, a generalist practice, and in some cases a lawyer would be very useful to have, but not if it was like a cyber security, like you want the right people who have a baseline understanding of the content that you're asking them to look into, I think.
But very rarely because the thing about that is you often need multiple skill sets, right?
That's true, yes.
And so we're talking about two different questions here. What skills does the head CAT person, chief reviewer, royal commissioner, whatever they are, need to have? And then what do they need to make sure they've plugged into all their blind spots and all their skill gaps to make sure that they understand it? Because I can think of very few problems where you don't need like a version of an accountant's, police sometimes work on some of these inquiries because they have a very excellent skill set for a certain number of things.
Yep.
The child safety ones we have run in South Australia have had child protection experts in them, run by judges. So I think there's two questions: head CAT skills, head CAT background, and then the team. And I think where it can get really tricky isn't so much when the head person is a jurist or a QC. It's when everybody who works for them is also a lawyer.
Yeah.
And we don't have an ops person, an ICT. And it depends on the problem you're looking into and all that stuff, but that you don't have, if it's a computer system, that there's not a very senior person there who's all about like systems and ICT, or I think it's about the team you put around them and underneath them. And if they are all lawyers, that is where, sorry, lawyer friends, I think if you are running an inquiry into children, computers, robo-debt, and every single human involved is a lawyer and there is no one else in the room, that is when you are really going to potentially hit the skids.
It's true. It's really true. Interestingly, a number of the inquiries I've been down the rabbit hole on, so Robodebt, but Grenfell Towers and the COVID inquiry as well, have made pretty good use of kind of expert panels, I guess, of kind of people who have particular expertise in things that like, so the Grenfell Towers one had like people who just knew a lot about planning and building regs, right? Yep. And like you go and you ask them questions. I know there's a real tendency at the moment to also think about lived experience expert panels as kind of providing that kind of advice. And I think that's also quite helpful. Of course, the challenge, right, is like a fundamentally human challenge, which is the ego of the head person needs to be sufficiently in check to be able to be curious and listen to a range of different skill sets. And so I think that is just like one of the challenges. And I don't know that lawyers are, well, I don't know, maybe this isn't true. I was going to say I don't know that lawyers are particularly egotistical and unlikely to listen to other people. But yes, I see from the faces of my colleagues that maybe lawyers are in fact
among any profession as it varies among the population, right? I'm sure it's a matter of personality.
Sure.
But so I am strongly of the view, and this is slightly inquiry and slightly oversight body, that one of the things we often get wrong is that we don't have ex-senior public servants in the room, and when we're doing various reviews and inquiries. And the reason it's a problem is because if there is no one there to translate what a public servant says.
Yes.
So I put in the 7-sex form and it was a green one and I loaded it into the system, and you need someone who understands practice enough to be able to say, and was that what the policy was? Oh, there was no policy, but was that just what it did? Was it your boss who told you to do it? Like, just practice stuff that's not written down in manuals for a Royal Commission or an inquiry to piece through. So it is really important that the people doing the inquiry, that there is people in there who can translate the content and to help.
But
yeah, I think I've told this story before of appearing before the Disability Royal Commission. Yeah, and like I was just asked questions about the legislative basis for the policy, and I wasn't asked any of the questions about how the actual decisions are made about money and resourcing, and I was just gobsmacked that was where it went.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's the challenge when you end up in those much more adversarial type of inquiries. Even when you have senior public servants before them, they feel like they're being interrogated rather than on a kind of shared inquisitory journey to get better information. So were they right to second sight?
So it's super interesting because, and a number of the people interviewed on this reflect on it, Second Sight go on to become like a key part of the activism campaign. They were a kind of reasonably dinky, I'd say, forensic accounting firm. Like they had two principals. That was it. Like, and they went through and looked at each individual case, and I think made common sense observations about both the case, but also about the system, about the nature of the contract, the unfairness of the contract, about the nature of the charging decisions that were being made around blah blah blah. Essentially, the business was able to ignore them because they sort of said, oh, you know, like they're out of their scope of practice when they talk to us about charging decisions, or they don't really know anything about IT systems. So their dinkiness, I think, both made them less beholden to Post Office, and they really were quite assertively independent, but also made them quite easy to write off. Yeah. So there's that part of it. And then the second part is they just weren't the right people to kind of look at the Horizon IT stack as a whole and say, there's something wrong with here, which is what Deloitte had promised to do. So yes and no, right?
Mm. Yeah, so you need to have some of the capabilities, but there is something there around independence and willingness to and also not hold your punches.
How to use compulsion, how to get the right information. I mean, the question of whether you can understand it is the next one, but you got to get it first, right? Like you got to get it before you can kind of prosecute it, I suppose.
Well, let's go to the next one then. So we've appointed a reviewer. What's the next step, Caroline?
So the next step is the way in which you structure the provision of information to the reviewer. And so I know you guys have all been on the other side of various reviews and inquiries, and you know there's lots of ways of doing it. I like to call this one the one where they forgot to ask the other side, because the Swift review, which was commissioned by incoming chair Tim Parker, to sort of see what was going on, and specifically Baroness Neville Rolfe was interested in this question of everyone keeps saying that the Post Office and Fujitsu can remotely access accounts, and Post Office keeps saying they can't. Like, could someone kind of get to the bottom of kind of why these things? So he commissions the Swift review, and he puts in place a secretariat. That secretariat comes from the legal division in Post Office, right? And in fact, that secretariat have quite a large role in shaping the terms of reference as well, which we could have discussed in the earlier section. And so the secretariat provide both the documentation, but also like the list of like who you should go and chat to. And what becomes really clear when you read the review post facto is that like a range of things were put in front of him that shouldn't have been put in front of him, and things weren't put in front of him that should have. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, right? So like really good example, Gareth Jenkins, who is the Fujitsu engineer who all the way back in 2013 they had discovered had misled the court, because when he'd been appearing as a witness in prosecutions, he'd never mentioned bugs, errors and defects that he knew about. So, like, they know internally he's unreliable. They've got a piece of legal advice that says we can't prosecute anymore because he's unreliable. Nevertheless, he is the person that they send this reviewer off to talk to get a good understanding of how the system works. But they don't send this reviewer the legal advice that says he's unreliable, right? So they give and they don't give various pieces of information. But the most important thing is, and this happens in lots of things, is essentially they do a desktop review, right? Like they look at what the procedures say should happen as opposed to what actually happens. And Swift never talks to a sub-postmaster who says, oh, well, that's not actually how that works.
Sorry, what? Never not one?
Never not one. Never not one. Never know.
Holy moly.
So that question of how do you get the information when people don't know what to ask for?
Yeah.
So a little bit like I would like a world where we did reference checks before we bothered with a whole heap of the rest of recruitment. I also think investigation should start with someone's capacity to wander around talking to junior people and say, so how does that work? What's going on over there? Where does that bit of money go? Do you save that? Do you take a note of that? Is there any records kept of that thing you're doing? Because I just think, particularly, I mean, the post office goes back quite a way, but we just write down less and less and have less and less records. And so like requesting policies and procedures that haven't been looked at for 15 years, their relationship with practice will often now be like miles. And so I think that before in order to figure out what they need to ask for, as I said, I think they need to walk the floor, right, and say, "What are you doing? How does that work? Can you balance your till? Show me how it's done." And then at the end of that, I would have thought they'd be able to go, "I need a copy of this record that comes out at the end of every day, this record that comes out at the end of every month, this record that does this." Because
but you'd never let. Like you would, like I'm feeling anxious just hearing that said, right? I would feel so exposed letting an independent reviewer just go and chat to peeps and kind of, because often, by the way, you know, random ASO 3 is doing something that is completely off policy and not reflective of anything that anyone is doing. And like, you know, like the randomness of that makes me feel so anxious.
Oh, for sure. Sorry, pipe dream and a bit weird, but Like, I just think that when we start with what we've written down, we in some ways already close the mind off, and we're doing what there should be.
The difference between what is written down and what actually happens. Yeah. Speaking of what is written down, what do we think about the value or otherwise of formal submissions to your review or inquiry?
Oh, God, I have such a controversial view about this.
Oh, I suspect it's the same as mine, though.
And I want to preface this by saying that although this is my general sense of how inquiries run, this is not how inquiries that I have been involved have run. But it's only because I made a very specific recognition that there was a tendency that this might be what would happen otherwise, right? Like, I just think no one reads the formal submissions, no one cares what they say. Like, I just think people put a lot of effort into formal submissions. And when my team come to me and say, should we put in a submission, I'm like, think about the top 4 dot points and do not write me something longer than 2 pages because I can guarantee no one's reading it.
Yeah, I fear for the amount of energy and effort that particularly like small non-profits and other groups put into the formal submission process, when I think more could be gathered from just a kind of a conversational...
A forum.
And I know it's an opportunity for everyone to have their say, and I don't want to diminish that because there might, obviously, a review can't speak to every sub-postmaster or whatever, but I do think there is sometimes an over-reliance on formal submissions that are not our shared best use of time and energy, either from the people making them or from the reviewer receiving them.
Yeah. I spend a bit of time helping organisations put some submissions together. I think they have values that are beyond the inquiry themselves, and by
That's
that
true.
what I mean is organisations are then coming up with a published position, because almost always submissions are published and there's variants, etc. And so the organisation itself gets its head a bit straighter about what it thinks about funding for this or whatever else, because they know it's going to be published. I do think, I'm with you. As a general, I'm with you though, Alison, which is a new PhD on such and such done by a bunch of volunteers, like bleeding of an evening trying to get it done, when bureaucrats and or inquiry people aren't going to get past Caroline's first 4 dot points on the 2-page. It is a problem. And the other one is that the legalistic nature of it, like the terms of reference, the letters
necessarily excludes certain people.
And so we're still only hearing from a corner of people.
Do you know what the post office inquiry did was they commissioned, I think it was Gallup, or it was like a Gallup similar, to go and do like human research with the sub-postmaster cohort. So they actually went and ran a poll, and then they came and had that. And like the poll was on things like, when was the last time you tried to get help from the help desk and how helpful was it, right? And I thought this was going to be the most boring testimony ever, but having just listened to hours of bloody the new leadership talk about how much they've invested in the helplines and the blah, 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 the poll data that suggests, 30% of the time it's helpful, I was just like, God, that's actually an excellent way of getting submissions, like of getting the evidence you want that wouldn't have been a pain in the ass for the people giving it to you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's something about going out and listening, I think, like about making an intentional choice of making it easy for people to tell you the stories that are relevant to your terms of reference and that are helpful. I mean, I cannot believe that these people did this as a desktop exercise, but I also just want to say a lot of the time we do inquiries or reviews as desktop exercises. Like it is often the kind of, we're like, we'll just do it as a first step and then see, and then you never do the next step.
Because your desktop review doesn't find the thing that would tell you what you need to know to do the next one.
I think that's the problem, right? I think there's something going on there that we should think about.
So what do we do then when whatever information gathering has taken place, good or bad, sufficient or insufficient, the reviewer has come to a view and they are making a report? Take us to the next step, Caroline.
All right, step 5. What do you do when you receive the report, or this one I like to call the one where the slide deck is the report, which I think is like a beautiful RoboNet synergy because it goes with the PwC 200 pages that became the 5 slides.
Slide decks aren't reports. I feel so strongly that we need to bring back Word and paragraphs, and not everything can be an infographic. And some problems require full sentences with punctuation. There, I'm done. I'm out. I'm just saying sometimes we need to write in whole paragraphs. That's all.
Do you know, I really disagree with you.
I know you do.
We need to get to the point. And if the point is buried in 90 pages of proper sentences, no one reads it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I worry people pad out reports by making them prosy, and we don't need to do that when you can just have the 5
like
dot
that
points.
Killer Jeff Mulgan advice on Post Office on Horizon, right?
Yes.
That we talked about in an earlier episode and that Caroline linked. It was like a page and a half, and it was it did have proper sentences and paragraphs, Danielle, but it was a brutally efficient use of language.
Yep. And it wasn't in any way it was very direct and conversational. It was not report language. It was your choice is because Post Office don't blah blah. It was very anyway. Really disagree, Danielle. And I also think one of the things we're going to hear now about from Alice Perkins, who missed the significance of a 2014 Deloitte report because they went back and engaged Deloitte in the end because they didn't like the second site thing. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Anyway, in 2014, Project Zebra, they also had great names for them. Project Zebra was a Deloitte report into the question of remote access, and they got the guy to come and talk to the board to say, these are our interim findings, here's what we've been hearing. And then they went away and wrote the report. Anyway, the gap between the slides for the board and the final report was large. And let's hear Alice talk about that gap.
Were you disappointed to receive a report which was limited and caveated in such a heavy way?
So we had a board meeting, I think it was in a few weeks earlier than this, at which the partner from Deloitte, who was responsible for this exercise, he'd come to that board meeting.
Yes.
And he had given the board an extremely positive sense of what Deloitte had found thus far, and that's recorded in the minutes. So I think it is really, really important to understand that. He had been present at the meeting. He had given a very clear and positive account of what he and his colleagues had seen so far, and there was a discussion about further work that should be done.
So were you surprised, therefore, to, if we scroll back down, to read all of these limitations?
So I think I said a minute ago, I don't recall seeing this report, and therefore I don't recall reading it. I do, however, remember that there was disappointment that Deloitte did not feel able to give us the kind of description of Horizon that we had expected would be forthcoming following Gareth James's appearance at the board, and that there were, as I understood it from Chris Ojard, a whole lot of reservations about the value of doing further work, the cost of it, and the time it would take.
So what is so interesting is the way that the kind of top takeaways, the executive summary, the 3 slides at the front can be wildly misleading in their tone and attitude, right? And so people use those to hide that buried on page 73, there is a thing that says, oh, by the way, they can remote access the computers and it's bad. So that's what I hate about long reports, Danielle, because I think people feel more comfortable putting a happy gloss on something if they know buried somewhere in 130 pages there is the sentence that says the thing. Whereas if you're only putting in 4 dot points, you kind of have to say the thing in the 4 dot points.
I think that goes over the top, but I think I think that all the work that goes into, I think there are a very small number, granted, but where you do need to explain your methodology properly, your kind of like the different themes and how you came at them and how you collected that and formed that view. I think the executive summary should work for 99% of people, but for instance, I think a CE should make it to page 20, and I'm not talking about hundreds of pages. I just mean like 20 pages.
Yeah,
and it depends on what it is.
Because I guess for me, having earlier this week decided to test my PTSD by reading the COVID inquiry report, many hundreds of pages of it, was what I felt was that the media coverage in terms of the kind of here's the top line takeaways from this report and what I thought the report was actually getting at was much more complex and complicated than could be summarised in a sort of 2-sentence grab because of the breadth of the issues that they were invited to contemplate.
You have to be still worried about the Columbia effect, right? So some things do have a whole page of it was a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this, and here with all of that is how I get to this one-liner. But the one-liner stands behind me explaining, like I went here and then I went there and here are the reasons, because some things are too complicated and you lose things in the translation down to the sucker punch of you did it wrong or the sucker punch of whatever. So I'm not arguing for like padding. I don't think when governments pay millions of dollars, I think some junior should be required to explain it all in a report and then put the slide deck on top.
I mean, what's so interesting is the selective lesson taking of seniors though, right? Like, so actually the lesson is less about the report preparation and more about listening to some of this stuff in post office in particular. I think as a director, I would be much more anxious about having fulfilled my fiduciary duties if I don't read the full reports on these things that I might otherwise do, because the number of times where not just the executive summary but the board paper written by your own team that goes over the top of the independent report, and that board paper selectively quotes, and the classic one is the second site report included a line that was like, there's no systemic failures in Horizon, by which they meant, and they literally say this at some point in the report, not all 17,000 terminals experience the same failure. So that's not sorry, exactly. But in the same way that, like, that Finn Pratt letter about the legality of the ombudsman thing was held up, right? People use that sentence for like a decade to say, remember? Second site said no systemic problem. So there's something very dangerous about that, I think. And I think as a leader, one of my key takeaways is read the whole bloody thing.
Yeah.
It's always interesting. Just on that though, it's just always very interesting when politicians get asked the day it's released, like, have you read the whole thing? And anyway, it's ridiculous. Just remind me how often big reports come out and senior people, mainly elected officials, are kind of knocked over the head with, can they quote chapter and verse from page 112? And it's like, not yet, mate, not yet.
Yeah,
I'll get there.
To that, though, I do think that there is an art in the writing of recommendations that come out of these kind of independent inquiries. And even when run by judges and lawyers and people who are, pretty good at technical and precise writing, too often the recommendations are so vague as to be unhelpful to the bureaucrats and the government, or helpful if you don't really want to do anything.
Super helpful to people who are happy to accept something in principle.
Exactly. We should do a better job of, talking to children in the care system or whatever. And it's like, no, you need to be really...
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really hard to ignore a specific recommendation.
Yes, and clearly someone has given that lesson to some royal commissioners who then make 332 specific recommendations, not all of which actually can cohere together into a coherent whole,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So again, there's a balance here. But I agree, like there's something about understanding the essence of what it is that you're recommending and making sure that is captured in something that is actionable or measurable.
And also why you need, back to my thing before, but why you need public servants in the Royal Commissions,
Yes.
because the principle of what the head cat might want to have happen, depending on how you draft that recommendation, may make it actually implementable or not at all. And
Yes.
so I'm not suggesting the is it possible part is always the job of a Royal Commission, but it is helpful if someone in the room says close to what you just said, but if we say it like this, they might actually might be able to find the money for it, or like
or the legislative authority.
If you're gonna make a recommendation from it, at least identify which level of government should be. I don't know, just like
no, that is my favourite though, where they just say government should, and you're like,
which one?
You're a Commonwealth Royal Commission. Which government are you recommending? Let's have a chat about that.
Or so the roles and responsibilities part, like the Aged Care Royal Commission, is I think a really excellent piece of work, and it says what future state should be, but it doesn't really give any steer as to who should do what into getting to the future state. And it's like, really?
So you should look at the South Australian Royal Commission into ECEC, which has some excellent roles and responsibilities.
Indeed it does, Caroline.
Thank you. But the other part of this is like, that's when you're drafting recommendations that you expect to be made public.
Yes, exactly. And we've sort of talked in a way that infers
public,
but they're not always public.
Almost none of the ones about which we are talking, none of the post office ones, except for the second site report, were made public. So they did a range of reviews. Some of them didn't even get distributed to their own board. So the Swift review, which I've mentioned a few times, was not distributed to the board because the General Counsel gave advice that distributing it to the board might obviate legal professional privilege, and therefore it might be FOI-able. So that, I think, is something as well in thinking upfront, how are you going to make sure that the people who need to see it are going to see it? And it was very clear Tim Parker had come in from outside government. It was clear he had never even thought about the question of would this be released? And then he gets this advice that says don't. And so he wrote a cover letter to Baroness Neville Rolfe, which softened lots of the conversation, which made it really hard to read what the actual recommendations were. It was already a soft report because they forgot to talk to postmasters. That, my friends, is how to make an unflattering review go away. And that's what the legal department in Post Office did.
Is it a bit weird not to have that end bit sorted at the beginning? Like,
yeah.
I mean, the Royal Commissions are a bit easier because, of course, it goes through its kind of process or whatever else. But even when you get an inquiry, like you're doing an inquiry into this or anything like it, so you get an ex-judge to look at an act to give you some advice as to whether it's still operating very well, and then you decide to do it. Even from the beginning, you know that there'll be a report. It might go to a CE, Secretary, Commissioner, and then it'll have a cover note put on it and it'll go to Cabinet, and then Cabinet will decide whether to release it or not. Even then, you'll have a conversation at the beginning usually about whether the intention, because usually when it's announced, they'll say, and we will release the report when we get it.
But not always, right? Like we've had some crackers in child protection in South Australia where there have been review after review commission, and again, always in that really challenging moment of, like I'm thinking about the Hyde review, I'm thinking about the one after, there's a very high profile and horrible thing happens and the government rightly wants to get to the bottom of it. So they put someone on it like the next day. And in a number of those cases, those reports have never been made public.
Yeah, because it's
not distributed widely in government.
Talk about the specifics of what happened to that specific child.
Yes. Yeah. The information privacy stuff is really, really challenging. And again, also you can go partway down the process and realise you're accidentally in a disciplinary process.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Yeah, so I don't think you always know. I think, so to be fair, Tim Parker was in fact chastised by the government for not showing it to his board 3 years after the fact when it was exposed by the inquiry. Again, I suspect it didn't feel like it felt a bit performative to me.
So I think that pretty much brings us to the end. Any final thoughts on conducting a review or an inquiry, what we would do differently if we were doing it again?
I think you can't rely on process and structure and choosing the right person to get it done. I think actually, if you want to find something out, you get all of those elements right, but then it is just actually work. Like, you have to do the work. If you're commissioning an inquiry into your own organisation, you have to be the one going out and saying to your organisation, don't be turdy and legalistic in your response to requests for information. Like, you as a leader, I think your responsibilities do not end with commissioning an inquiry if you actually want to know the answer.
Mine would be more time on terms of reference and scope, and not less time on anything else, but just more time there.
Yeah.
And the other one is, aside from whoever the head caddies and what their skills are there people in the room of whatever the process is who understand the work?
Yeah.
Yep. Excellent discussion, ladies. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.